Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Nikki Kane and I'm going to be sort of facilitating this first session. So this is the first session of the 2024 Professional Development Days, which are organised by the Doctoral and Early Career Researcher Committee of the Association for Art History. This is a voluntary committee that sort of facilitates and organises a number of events with the Association for Art History aimed at kind of doctoral and early career researchers. This is the Professional Development Day, which, as you'll have noticed, is taking place over 2 days this year. And this is where we sort of focus on career development and professional advice and insights, mostly targeted at those of you who are doctoral or early career research stages, but is sort of open to all. So some of you may be at different levels and you're very welcome. So this is an online event that's going to run this afternoon and tomorrow morning. And we've kind of targeted this at those working in kind of art and art history in quite a broad sense. So I guess to also include those of you who might be working in other kind of cultural fields, art practice, and so on and so forth. The programme this year has a number of presenters who we're very grateful are joining us, and they're going to sort of discuss their professional experiences and offer kind of advice and guidance. And we hope that it'll also be a bit of a space for sort of honest conversation and discussions about the realities of working in, cultural field and kind of art professionals quite broadly. For the programme, we've got a mix of panel discussions and then some more kind of practical focused workshops. So this is the first session, which is the Curating Roundtable, and this will be followed by a grants and bursaries workshop later on this afternoon. And then tomorrow morning, we've got a seminar which will look at copyright and image permissions. And then we have a workshop which looks at CVs and cover letters. So we'll get started with this kind of first session. I'll do a little bit of housekeeping. So we are recording this session, but that's just for our own sort of personal use. We're not going to put it anywhere. One of the things that we're hoping we might be able to do is pull any sort of interest in resources, pointers, suggestions, things that might arise from the discussion or from our speakers. So we'll use the recording just to gather those so that that can be shared on the website or through other resources. We're here for about an hour in this session. We will have some time at the end for questions, so please do gather those. You can also use the chat box if you want to sort of share kind of questions throughout. So we'll get started. So this, as I said, is a curating roundtable, and we're going to think about sort of different models for curating or working with galleries, collections, historical settings, museums, public engagement, all of that kind of stuff. And we'll also discuss some of the ways that working in this way might be a means of disseminating sort of art historical research rather than just sort of thinking only about publications. And we'll also think a little bit about some of the practical issues working in kind of different contexts, formats, scales, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm very pleased to be joined by 3 speakers who have very generously agreed to share their insight and expertise with us. We have Dr. Maria Mahadi Hamadani, who is a lecturer in modern and contemporary art of global diasporas at Edinburgh College of Art at University of Edinburgh. And so alongside her publishing and academic and teaching work, she has a wealth of sort of curatorial experience as a postdoctoral research associate at the Yale Centre for British Art. She co-curated the exhibition Bridget Riley, Perceptual Abstraction. And she's also held curatorial positions at Wichita Art Museum, the Ulrich Museum of Art, Cleveland Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland and Tate Liverpool. We're also joined by Dr. John Chu, who is Senior National Curator at the National Trust. He's been a curator there since 2015 and has curatorial responsibility for historic picture and sculpture collections nationwide and for all aspects of properties in the Midlands. And he's also lectured, published and broadcast on British art of the long 18th century, art collecting in early modern and modern homes. And Jennifer Powell is the director of the Barber Institute of Fine Arts and Barber Professor of Fine Arts at the University of Birmingham's Department of History of Art, Curating and Visual Studies. Prior to this, she was the curator of painting and sculpture at the Royal Academy of Arts, and associate professor at University of Cambridge. And prior to that, she began her curatorial career with the V&A, before taking up post of assistant curator of modern British art at Tate Britain, and was then head of collections, programme and research at Kettle's Yard at the University of Cambridge. So thank you for joining us. I think from those biographies we can sort of tell there's a lot of very rich experience. I wonder if I could just sort of ask each of you to sort of introduce yourselves and the work that you sort of do now. I think one of the things that I think people will be really interested to hear about is just a bit more detail in what are your roles now? What does that really look like day to day? Mariam, I wonder if you want to go first.
Sure. Yeah, I will. I mean, it's probably a bit of a longer story as to how I got to where I am now. I would say that in terms of curatorial work, so during my undergraduate degree, for example, I had my first degree in studio arts at Wichita State University. So I'm originally from Kansas in the US. I didn't really realize that there were, sort of careers in the museum world or curatorial industry. We really didn't have much of a museum presence, I would say, in Wichita, Kansas. There are some, but I think it was my first internship. I came across it at the University Museum at Wichita State University that sort of led me to be interested in curatorial practice. And from my undergraduate degree, I pursued an art history undergraduate degree, and then that sort of led me to pursue a master's in museum studies in Cleveland, Ohio. And I do want to say that all of the sort of curatorial experience I have had, mostly apart from my postdoc at Yale, was actually internship. So I come from it maybe a bit more, maybe I feel a bit more like of an imposter in terms of the curatorial work, but the kind of work I have done was largely unpaid, was interning for all of these museums and gaining experience. So I got a MA in museum studies, and during that time I was able to curate exhibitions independently. I had opportunities with that particular program to actually curate exhibitions of, master's students at Cleveland Institute of Art. So that was sort of that experience. And I ultimately thought I wanted to go into sort of the museum industry or into the museum field or curatorial field. That's sort of what my training had led me to do. But I began, and for a lot of reasons, which you can probably talk about in maybe more detail together as a group, is I sort of pivoted with my PhD. I think one of the things that was really great about my experience, I had an internship at the Tate in Liverpool right after my master's program, and it was that internship, it was actually that experience that led me to pursue a PhD. And I can get into those details a bit more later, but in terms of that particular experience working on that exhibition, it led me to define a research question that has ultimately become the crux of my research now, which is thinking about the politics of immigration and how that's related to artists immigrating from, the so-called Commonwealth and Empire in Britain after World War II. But it was because of that led me to my PhD. And ultimately what happens was I ended up concentrating instead on teaching in my PhD program, but teaching with collections as well at the university collections at the University of Texas, Austin, so the Blanton Museum of Art, our Contemporary Art Center there as well. So I would say that in terms of how I come through, curatorial practice or research comes from and stems from sort of my initial interest in curating and curatorial practice. And I should mention, then I'll shut up. So right now I'm a lecturer and I do teach, of course, modern and contemporary art, but I'm also the program director for the Masters by Research in Collections and Curating Practices here at ECA. And so a lot of the kinds of things that, I've thought about or had to grapple with are kinds of things that I try to teach or try to find ways of having my students sort of learn from our partner institutions that we partner with. So we have institutions here at National Museum of Scotland, National Galleries of Scotland, for example. So I guess I'll sort of be quiet now, but that's sort of where I'm coming through is kind of from a teaching sort of experience.
Thank you. That's really useful. And I think maybe we can sort of come back to that. I think one of the things that I sort of initially thought about was sort of research being sort of disseminated through kind of curatorial work. But I think there's something really interesting there about the curatorial work being a sort of way of researching or teaching and so on and so forth. I wonder if I could come to you, Jennifer, and think a little bit about, your sort of role just now and your kind of career journey so far.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much. Really interesting to hear previous speaker. I think my roots probably slightly similar in some ways, different in others. I always describe my way into curatorial work as sort of looking to be quite traditional and extremely kind of privileged and without sort of problem, really, and it really wasn't that. So, and by that I mean I was lucky to do a PhD, which was funded by the AHRC at that point in time, which was about post-war sculpture at the University of Birmingham. And then after that, I started a sort of postdoc, which was really a research project, which was called Mapping Sculpture. And it was really lucky that that project was both research-based, and it was actually largely a database system, but it also was very much tied to the V&A. And so I was, I had an opportunity to curate a sort of mini exhibition at the V&A as part of that project. And really, for me, that led me into the curatorial world. I originally thought I was going to go into academia. I wanted to be only in teaching. And then I sort of took a very different route again. So I suppose there's also, usually there seems to be like a pivot point for many of us that directs us into a certain area. So I did that postdoc, and then I went to Tate Britain, and I was an assistant curator at Tate Britain for 3.5 years in the Modern British department. The director at the time was Penelope Curtis, and that was a really formative kind of experience for me. And then I suppose I stayed there for a relatively short space of time, and then went to Kettle's Yard, which is part of the University of Cambridge. And that really took me back into a university setting, but also into a space that was very much in a period of change. So during my time at Kettle's Yard, where I ran the exhibition programme, the collections, and the wider kind of learning programmes with my colleagues, we were embarking on a capital project. So the museum really changed. What we thought about in terms of our programme was really changing, and it was really exciting and wonderful to be part of that. But there I really focused on, I would say, research-led exhibitions around archives, but also thinking about working with contemporary artists and collections a lot. And so that really gave me some brilliant experience of working with contemporary artists in different ways, but mostly connecting to archive and collections research, which I was really grateful for. And then I left Kettle's Yard after about 8 years and went to the Royal Academy, totally different experience again, large museum, where the collections team is separate to other teams, which is similar to my experience way back in the V&A, when the teams were quite separate, but really trying to find ways of working together again a bit more closely. And also really interesting to see the impact of Royal Academicians and, again, living artists on historic collections and what that means for the collection. And then I started this role at the Barber just over a year ago as director. And I suppose yeah, in a similar way to Kettle's Yard, the Barber is part of a university. So it's a university collection. It's actually owned by a trust. The building's owned by the university. It's going through a period of change. So we're just doing some capital works at the moment, which are improvement works rather than extension. And we are thinking about things like working with artists, rehanging our collection. So thinking about research as a process of sort of collection rehangs, which was something I also did at Tate. And also thinking about how we work with students. And we also have a strong MA program here where students curate exhibitions in our gallery spaces. So yeah, in summary, I guess that's me.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think there are maybe some interesting things for us to sort of come back to there about sort of research-led exhibitions and the different ways that research sort of shapes the work that you do. John, I wonder if we could come to you then to sort of say a little bit about your work now and how you came to be there.
Yeah. So I'm a senior national curator at the National Trust. And to be a senior national curator, that means you take responsibility for a particular heritage asset across all of the collections across the nations and regions of the National Trust. And my area is pictures and sculptures. And it also means I take responsibility for like a geographical area. So all the properties that fall within a particular part of the country or countries. So I'm Midlands. So I've got these two roles where I'm working nationwide and then doing a more deep dive across different like heritage assets, collections, properties in the Midlands. I came, and that obviously there's no particular pattern to my days because that's obviously accounts for me. So there's leaderships involved around like setting strategic direction for those, and then for that nationwide work, and then all the day-to-day of sort of acquisitions, loans out, setting up research projects, which I suppose we'll talk about later, cataloguing, all of the day-to-day collections work and the strategic thinking. I guess I came to curating through art history, and I did my MA and PhD on 18th century European art. Both of those were AHRC funded, very fortunate. But I guess I took that step with a view to curatorship, because I actually did English as an undergraduate. And then after I graduated, did a few of those. I call them internships, but actually they were more like work experience because they were unpaid and they weren't over like a period of more than months. So I did an internship in an auction house, a commercial gallery, and in a marketing department of a Museum of Modern Art in Oxford. And realised I didn't have like the social connections to go straight into curating. That's kind of how it was set up there. So it had to be through the academic route. And that's why I took the step to go to the Courtauld and take postgraduate studies. Post my PhD, I was actually teaching at the Courtauld for a while and also working part-time at Tate on a cataloguing project, which I think is probably quite a classic route through from academic studies into curating. So I took that step working on Turner's sketchbooks and cataloguing those at Tate. And then continued to actually, my pivot was a long pivot. So it was, I was teaching and then working part-time as what was called a national specialist at the National Trust, where I was just working on picture and sculpture specific work, but across all of the periods of history that we cover. So everything from modern to contemporary art was what I was working on there, and just supporting all of the properties and their picture and sculpture works, whether they're exhibitions, displays, and then that list of things like acquisitions, displays, redisplays, conservation work's a big part of where our research energy goes and resource goes into supporting conservation works, you can imagine, at a trust. And then, segued into a more of a leadership role and then taking on a regional asset as well. So like it'll be 9 years in July at the National Trust. So that's how I've ended up here.
Amazing, thank you all. Okay, I want to just sort of pick up on some of the things that maybe sort of cut across what you've said so far. So I think this sort of idea of a kind of a journey and a sort of pivot and so on is a kind of common aspect. And I think it's interesting that you've all taken different routes and directions and so on. But I think there's something interesting about, I guess, the place of postgraduate study in kind of different forms, and then also sort of work experience, internships, and so on. And I think we sort of know that it's very difficult, and it's sort of becoming more and more difficult to work within kind of the cultural sector and so on. But I wonder if you could maybe just sort of reflect on, yeah, where that's sat within your own kind of career journey, and yeah, the value of that, or some of the challenges you might have experienced, or the skills that helped you develop. Mariam, do you want to go first again?
All right, put me on the spot. That's fine. In terms of, yeah, I think work experience, I mean, I'll be honest here, you know, the reason why I pivoted to a PhD in for teaching is because I couldn't get a job in the curatorial field. This was back in 2009 when we had, you know, a whole recession situation happening. So I had several interviews. I thought my internship at the Tate was going to be the one that was going to get me a job back in the US, you know. And it didn't, but I had several interviews. I had the experience, but it was experience that was largely, I didn't produce any, you know, exhibitions or an exhibition catalog or anything that was sort of a deliverable sort of thing, I think, until after that fact. I had done some displays and as an adjunct curator for the Wichita Art Museum. So that was something I actually did after I returned from my internship at Tate. So 2009 was when I got my master's degree. I went and had the internship at the Tate, and it was really valuable experience for me. I worked on the catalog for a couple of exhibitions, the Afro-Modern Journeys Through the Black Atlantic. That was the exhibition that sort of defined my PhD career path, in the sense that that sort of formed a research question for me. And ultimately, I did pivot towards teaching, but for also for other reasons besides that. Not that I couldn't get a job necessarily, that was part of it, but also I realized that the sort of experience I had in several different exhibitions or several different museums. So I had interned and worked in, you know, city-ran museums in Wichita, Kansas, museums that were non-collecting contemporary art spaces, to sort of this sort of old, sort of stodgy kind of, you know, the sort of mausoleum kind of museums, like with encyclopedic collections, like the Cleveland Museum of Art, which which is a fascinating, really great collection. So different types of institutions, and I think, you know, you kind of realize that each of those institutions has different ways of, depending on how that institution is ran, as a curator, the kinds of things and kinds of roles that you would take on, right? So in these smaller sort of local museums, regional museums, in my experience, you have to wear many hats. So it's not just a question of the curatorial research, and that's just such a small portion of that job, when there's all the other things to do, which is sort of the kind of diplomacy or diplomatic relations between you and a private collector, or between you and the staff, or between you and a living artist, for example. Yeah, I'll leave that there and allow other people to speak.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. I suppose maybe I could say something. What I often get asked is it worth doing a PhD? Or people often say to me, is it worth, you know, should I do a PhD or should I do a master's? And having sort of been, again, in a sort of uncomfortably privileged position in shortlisting and interviewing people, it is an increasingly kind of difficult question to answer, to be honest. But I think it's probably helpful to say that I went straight into, I did a master's, which I got funding for, and I went straight into a PhD, which I also got funding for. I couldn't have done it without funding. And funding for PhDs is also becoming more difficult, you know, every year. But the great thing about some of the PhD award schemes is obviously the collaborative doctoral awards, where you're getting some experience of working in the museums sector through that PhD, which I think is probably helpful. But for me, the positives about doing a PhD were that I did use that kind of research base, I suppose, often throughout the rest of my career, even though maybe I didn't think I was going to at some points. So I do think it probably was helpful in enabling me to get my role at Tate, because that was still a kind of specialist department. And I suppose it's also thinking about, you know, some of the larger scale national museums and also international museums are still based around specialisms, although again, that I would imagine that is becoming less and less the case, but those specialisms, you know, period specialisms do still exist in some spaces. So it definitely helped me to get into that role. And then I also used it in other things. So for example, I contributed to a Tate research project with research that I'd done in my PhD. I taught in various university settings using my PhD research, essentially my postgraduate research. And I also found being able to do that teaching alongside my curatorial work when I wasn't able to get a job was very helpful in terms of providing some sort of income, but also keeping my interest in my subject going. And then, yeah, I think I'm a bit more hopeful for the kind of internship sector at the moment, because when I was doing internships, which I did an awful lot of during my PhD, they were all unpaid. So I was doing a full-time PhD and also internships in smaller regional museums, none of them paid. This is not a woe is me statement, but I think it's important that a lot of museums now should be moving towards a kind of paid internship model. So at least that opens up these routes, but they are also still enormously oversubscribed, which I've experienced in 3 different institutions now. And I think, yeah, it's very difficult to answer that question of should you do a PhD, should you have a master's, you know, all of those things. And I think it's not necessary, there is no answer to that question other than you've got to build up some experience somehow. So whether that be really focusing on the internship route and the practical experience, you know, that's also as valid. Yeah, so I don't know my answer to the question, but I just thought that might help a bit.
Thank you. It's not an easy question for anyone, I don't think. John, I wonder if you want to jump in. I'm sort of interested in you sort of mentioning kind of work experience or internships in like a range of kind of settings.
Yeah, I mean, just to like answer the first question that was on my mind around what Jennifer said about the I guess the research terrain's changed a bit, and what's expected of a doctorate has changed through the HRC. So I think, well, it's clear that work experience is built into the work, like thinking about impact and public benefits is part of the program. Whether you're doing a CDA or any kind of PhD, you have the option to build in those kind of professional skills outside of academia, which I think is fantastic. But in terms of like, you know, how you would frame a PhD experience as setting you up for a curatorial work, I suppose you could think of it in terms of like there's the expertise you build up in a particular area, like deep knowledge, like Jennifer says, like there is still a requirement in many places for you to have that kind of clout or that I guess that like expertise or like a deep knowledge of something that will be helpful for the heritage or arts organizations. Like they're built on something which is collections, and you know, if you can enhance that, that's really good. So like choose your subject wisely, I suppose. And then there's like research skills, which are really important because as a curator, you deploy those skills independently of that knowledge in so many different ways, whether you're contributing to a book and doing like several years of research, if you get the funding to do that within your role, or whether it is just something much more narrow and instrumental towards like a particular acquisition or conservation project or technical analysis project, whatever it is. Like you do need to like draw on and that's the joy of it, is that you apply those hard-won skills to like a range of different kind of projects and scale of projects as a curator, I suppose. So I'd say it's like it kind of separates out a bit. but it doesn't give you everything. So there's so many aspects of being a curator which you don't learn within a PhD, and you have to acquire them somehow, whether it's, you know, understanding what like a statement of significance is for historic England, or you know, thinking like for audience, like public first, like, you know, how you arrange an exhibition so that it does have the range of public benefits, like an Arts Council England bid for funds. I mean, it doesn't set you up, so you do have to like think about how you are going to build up that suite of knowledge. And then there are things like I know people within the trust have done PhDs, and they get like an entry-level job in a collection as like a collections assistant or something, and then they can then apply for like a curatorial apprenticeship scheme within the trust. And like people are really kind of like really benefiting from that route through, and the PhD really does count. So that deep knowledge, and then you build up the arts and heritage like practical experience afterwards. So like I suppose be like versatile to the opportunities that come along, I would say. And like PhD, like really, I'd say, I think it is a big benefit in terms of employment, but it doesn't sit alone.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful, that sort of versatility as well as specialism. It's a bit of a sort of balance of both. I wonder if we could then maybe think, because we've sort of talked a little bit about research in different sorts of ways, and obviously a lot of our attendees will be in the midst of big research work. I wonder if we could just maybe think a little bit about, yeah, the ways in which research factors into the day-to-day work that you do or your colleagues do in your institutions. I wonder if we could start with you, John, in terms of, you mentioned, you know, the importance of research for things like conservation and acquisitions and so on. I wonder if you could just sort of expand on that a bit.
Yeah, so I guess it would all be, you know, I guess research works at every stage of like, so yeah, let's take a conservation project. It's like, how do you establish how you spend limited resource on conservation? And that is partly on need. So if something's falling apart, it needs conservation, but that won't be the only criteria. It'll also be a whole range of other different things, like significance, like how important is it, how rare is it, and then a part of significance is it's like people value, you might call it, or like, you know, public benefit, probably more familiar phrase. So like, why is this thing important? You have to research that in order to understand that. Like, what are the research options as you go along? How much would you spend on like the conservation itself versus like technical analysis? So all those like scientific imaging and sampling techniques to help you understand what you're looking at, like what kind of evidence, how that evidence feeds into the documentary evidence, the secondary literature, all those things that are like really familiar from like a PhD work goes into it. It goes into that kind of thing. And then you might, you know, resources depending, you might publish those findings and, you know, use all your skills of, you know, writing, publishing, you know, just all the things that go into that in order to provide like a wider public, like a bigger impact, I suppose, if it's a peer-reviewed article. But then if you're like, you know, if you're writing for your examiner, aren't you, and you're writing a PhD, so you're thinking about your audience in a really particular way, and you gather the information you need about that audience in order to make your PhD as persuasive as possible and therefore pass. And that's kind of, it takes practice, but it's kind of the same for all the different audiences for your research and work, I guess, curatorial work, across all the different outputs, I suppose. So if you want money from the art fund, you have to understand what that audience is in order to acquire something. If you're writing a label for the public, that's another audience. If you're writing a pamphlet or a catalogue entry, catalogue essay, that's a different audience again. But if you're thinking in that way, it's kind of like wordsmithing, I suppose, as well as like not over researching, like researching in a way which is appropriate to the outcome, I suppose, outputs. So
yeah, thank you. Jennifer, I wonder if you wanted to jump in here. You sort of mentioned a kind of focus on sort of research-led exhibitions as part of the work that you did. I wonder if you could just sort of expand on what that means in your experience and I guess in practice.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I often use that term and then think, what do I also mean? So by that I meant really that in quite a lot of the work that I was doing in Kettle's Yard was thinking about archives that we either had or would be able to access that could form the basis of new exhibitions or new narratives that we might want to bring out. And also thinking about how we were trying to, and this is something maybe that especially in my experience, university museums are seeking to do, trying to kind of throw open the question of what research looks like, or what a research outcome can be. So, for example, at Kettle's Yard, I made an exhibition which was about the work of quite obscure abstract expressionist artist called Richard Pousette-Dart, who we happened to have in the collection. We had loads of archives that hadn't been touched. I mean, it was like the ideal project, really. And then it so happened that his estate also had an enormous archive that hadn't been looked at before. So this was the first exhibition of his work in the UK, solo exhibition. And it resulted in various things. And in this case, a book was one of those things, because sort of as John was intimating there, it felt like that would be an appropriate outcome to this exhibition. The exhibition itself was obviously a research project, but there were no sort of publications that included this rich kind of archival material as well. So it felt like that was sort of appropriate, could have been a peer-reviewed article or something else. And then simultaneously I was working on another exhibition, which was an artist-led project with Anthea Hamilton, who was very interested in looking at the Kettle's Yard archive and thinking about that for her own practice-based research. And then the outcome of that project, we did also produce a small publication, but the outcome was 2 exhibitions, one that she created and sort of used the collection in different ways, but also made work in response to. So it was, for her, it was a practice-based research project, I think. I mean, I don't know how she'd describe it. So, and both of those things were really rich in terms of kind of, deep dive, I suppose, in the way that you would in a PhD or a master's into a topic, finding the interesting narratives and kind of expanding on them or exploding them in some way. But I think probably what I find myself doing more and more now currently is thinking about more collaborative based research projects and research exhibition projects, or thinking about rehangs. How can they be more collaborative? How can research be initiated with others? So whether that's users of the gallery or non-user groups or communities, etc. So I feel like all of these things are research rich, but just have different forms, and so that feels quite exciting. And I suppose it sort of does in some way show that research is kind of still at the crux of most of the things that I'm doing, but just very much adapted to different ways of working. And they almost all involve people, which I think my experience of my PhD was, it was quite insular. I didn't have an enormous network. It just wasn't, there weren't the forums for kind of sharing what that research meant. And so, I think that's something which I've definitely had to build during my career, how to involve people and make research relevant to many people.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that's come from you and from John in terms of thinking about publics and who they might be. Mariam, I wonder if you want to say something about sort of research and curating or kind of exhibition making, whether that's, being a postdoc research fellow and producing an exhibition, or in the kind of the teaching work that you're doing as well, where students are researching, but there's kind of curatorial work and collections and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just to kind of piggyback on what Jennifer said in terms of like a people-centered approach to curatorial practice, or in terms of involving communities essentially, or collaboration in terms of how you do exhibition making or exhibition making. I think the first thing, with my students or with teaching, while they're kind of developing these curatorial projects that they work on. So they work on these curatorial projects every year with one of the partner institutions. So this last year, so for last year, they, one of the groups did a display at the Talbot Rice Gallery, which is a university gallery at the University of Edinburgh, and it was a display on the histories of Old College, which has a lot of histories and ties, the University of Edinburgh to enslavement, to histories of enslavement, to economics of enslavement as well. So I think the first thing too is to kind of note is, PhD research is a different thing altogether, and but also similar because you are dealing with different types of audiences. But it's also, in terms of exhibition making, it's a kind of research in of itself that, at least in my experience as a postdoc, at least my specific experience working on these exhibitions at Yale, at the Yale Center for British Art, there's a lot that you don't really learn, that you learn from doing, and a lot of that has to be with, certain types of roles, like being an architectural critic, for example, I suppose, like understanding the space in which you're, producing an exhibition. What is that space? What is the history behind that space? How is that sort of narrative significant in how you're contextualizing those objects that you're showing? And also in terms of thinking, for students when they're writing these kinds of histories, to think about how you write, didactic text for an exhibition, or how you're doing research on objects that are, sometimes from marginalized communities or have been marginalized in the collections or even in the way they're being displayed, to kind of consider what kind of counter models, what kind of counter histories can you create in an exhibition to kind of reimagine the collections of a museum in ways that can sort of mitigate or neutralize or call attention to kind of imbalanced hierarchical kind of power structures of, the kind of traditional Western museum. And then in terms of that collaboration in communities, and that's one kind of way, is how do you do away with the perceived neutrality and authoritative voice of the museum as an institution, and the way that you write didactic text on an object that might have sort of contested histories, or come from a marginalized place or location, or from an artist who's been marginalized in the past, or community-based. And so that is sort of, how do you kind of take away a mono narrative for the kind of, in terms of the way you write or narrativize an exhibition, in ways that can be maybe more inclusive, and how do you involve communities in that sort of that research as well?
Yeah, thank you. I'm kind of conscious of time, so I want to sort of invite people, if they have any questions, to maybe start to throw them into the chat. But Mariam, you sort of also pointed me usefully in the direction of my next question, because one of the things I think is really interesting across all of your work is that sort of the particularities of the sites or the spaces or the types of collections or objects that you work with. I guess, John, there's probably a lot of really rich heritage and history that you have to sort of navigate and kind of consider, whether that's in, how things are interpreted or what's displayed or so on and so forth. So I wonder if you could say something a little bit about that. And then I'm also interested, Jennifer, in the different types of places that you've worked in, some being very sort of specific, like Kettle's Yard, which is quite a kind of particular sort of place, and then, yeah, sort of university settings, more sort of big museums and so on and so forth. John, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I suppose like the process of getting acculturated or more experience within the National Trust is like, there is a agility required, I suppose, from that quite you coming out of that world of art history, art historical research, and even like through the museums, to pivoting to the National Trust, where it is like art is just one aspect of a heritage experience, and the heritage experience is just one part of a big day out for a family. But then also, that's like the the experience that people have of art in our places, but also within like the wider cultural like media context, like the huge changes in the cultural perspectives that are happening, like our ambition to tell full histories within that space. It's like a real, there's a lot of things to take into account, I suppose. And like within that, our, just to narrow it down, like our principal form of interpretation in our places is through room guides, who are more often than not volunteers. So like think about that as a form of dissemination. How does my art historical research, which takes place within like a really wide like cultural and like academic range of matters, like transform into training, which then becomes verbal interpretation on the ground with a whole range of different people. So that gives you a sense of the complexity of it, and the need to like, but then also like the need for that rigorous foundational knowledge, right? So that absolute like, not control of like the facts as it were, but of the evidence that informs interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. Now just sort of thinking about the role of sort of volunteer guides. That's actually quite complicated. Yeah. Jennifer or Mariam, do either want to sort of jump in there?
Shall I, Mariam? Yeah, I think all I would probably add is that for me, all the institutions I've worked with have been just totally different in terms of scale, the structure of the organization, what's valued and may not be as valued, and but all of them are interested in their own histories and in their sort of narratives, and therefore a lot of the work that I've done in sort of heads of programming roles, or in this role that I'm in now as director, is trying to really think about what is the element of the history of this space, or what it should be doing. How can we kind of use its heritage and think about how that can be relevant today? What relevance can that heritage bring to today that then provides a kind of shape for a program? So, the Barber Institute, for example, it's a historic Grade 1 listed building. It was set up by Lady Barber, who was a sort of trailblazer in her day. It's a historic Western art collection that tells a single narrative chronologically to date. We've got brilliant contemporary spaces in the city. So we're not a contemporary space, but we also still have a collection that we want, to find relevance through. So yeah, I think often what I've found is that the institutions or the histories of those spaces themselves have provided like the original research that I've been able to do, and that has kind of led into other things for kind of program or exhibition programs around those spaces. And there's a question in the chat here that Andrew asked really early on, which is about kind of how to, as a postdoc, how to get into curating through paid opportunities, which are feeling still to be difficult and exclusive, which I 100% agree with and understand. And I think one of the ways that I would suggest is to really try and find, if you're deeply embedded in a PhD or a research project already, try to identify institutions who connect to those areas of your research or connect to the themes that you're exploring, and really try and kind of, look at whether they have specific opportunities, or could you contact someone there and find out whether there's a way that you could begin to work with them, through something that might not be advertised. But I just feel if you've got this incredible research base already, obviously we can say, yes, try and build up your, sell your skills for other things like project management, all of those things, which you would naturally do if you were applying for a role. But maybe it's also sometimes trying to find those kind of specificities with what other people are interested in their narratives, or what your research could bring to that institution and its narratives. I think that could be helpful, because I often am contacted by researchers who are proposing a project, which is brilliant. It's an amazing project. It's so interesting. But it's got absolutely nothing to do with, the institution that I'm working in. So I might be personally totally fascinated by it, but there's got to be a reason that would come into this program or do something, that would flip the program in an interesting way. But there's got to be a relevance there. So yeah, that's what I'd say on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very good advice. Mariam, I wondered if you wanted to jump in there, having sort of done a kind of postdoctoral position that involved curating. Does that feel like it's a good approach to be able to build in that kind of output as part of a fellowship or something?
Well, I mean, just to piggyback on, back again on Jennifer's, what you kind of said about unpaid internships, really, which is something that maybe I think it seems like the industry is changing to a certain extent, and I'm not quite sure, because again, my kind of experience is mostly based in the U.S. and American institutions, but and it was unfortunate because they were all unpaid, and the whole reason why I was able to do some of these was because some of them were connected to my program, so they were opportunities that were built into that program, or I just had student loan money and I was able to go and live in Liverpool for 4 months and work on have an internship because I had leftover student loan money. But it is really prohibitive, and it really is that is an issue, and I hope that that's changing. But I think my experience as a postdoc at Yale, I was in the research department, so it wasn't actually meant to be a sort of curatorial role. And so on top of working on curatorial projects and co-curating an exhibition and doing collections research and things like that, I was also in charge of developing symposiums and research-led workshops and seminars. So we did, especially, and this was all during COVID as well, so this is sort of the online world of Zoom. This is actually sometimes triggering when I get back on Zoom to remember those days of talking to people on the screen. But one of the things I will say in terms of opportunities for the question that was asked about being a postdoc and how to kind of get your foot in the door in that way. That's another thing too, is we were approached by postdocs or PhD researchers at Yale and outside of Yale wanting to work on projects that could have been, that we, did ultimately do at Yale. I mean, research symposiums, for example, we had exhibition proposals that were submitted by researchers outside of Yale and within Yale, and some of those were in historically at the Center for British Art picked up. So there are opportunities, but again, like Jennifer says, it's identifying, in your research, finding that kind of project, that sort of project within your larger project that looks like something you can turn into an exhibition that is specifically related to the particular institution that you're looking at. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'm conscious that we only have a few minutes left, so I just want to sort of invite anyone, if they have any questions, to sort of throw them into the chat, or sort of raise a hand and you could probably sort of jump in. We've got a question about how to sort of write a research proposal for an exhibition or a project. If anyone has any sort of suggestions or can point to any resources for that.
I'm not aware of sort of any great resource, but I think again it's sort of case by case. And I mean, I actually have to confess that this is not something that the Barber has at the moment, but usually many galleries do have a sort of, if you're interested in proposing something to us, this is what we need you to include. And my only other sort of general tip would be to be really concise, i.e. pages and pages of a proposal is probably not the way forward. So sort of 2-page proposal, and also to really try to think about things that may not feel particularly happy to think about, but such as cost. So again, if you're proposing an exhibition to an institution that has a collection, then how could the collection be involved in this exhibition? Are you thinking about proposing an exhibition that is all loans from the US, for example, to a UK institution? That would even be difficult now for, the nationals to kind of deliver. So I think, yeah, the conciseness, why it's to that institution in particular, check their own guidance, and then think about practical things like where are the loans coming from, and the potential impact of cost, not necessarily to provide a cost analysis for them, but just thinking about that as you propose this project. And the other thing I've always found quite helpful is if people have sort of thought about a scale of a project. So, you know, there could be these multiple ideas for its delivery, and one of them might be a full-scale exhibition, but another might be a small intervention in the gallery or a conference that could lead on to something else. So yeah, maybe trying to think more broadly about what a research outcome could be again, I suppose. Don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, I'd say to add to that, like look at what it is that organizations trying to achieve at a given time as well. So often they publish online like an annual report or a strategy statement, or they might have like research, like National Trust has research priorities, and the reasons those priorities are there online, so that you're maybe not so you're parroting what they're saying, but so you understand what their priorities are, what they're trying to achieve, and how your projects will help them achieve that, because it'll just smooth everything along. And it's just like quite a good exercise for like anything, like working with an organization, whether you're applying for a job or making a proposal. It's just things that seem quite alien and abstract when you're working on a PhD are actually like what those people you're communicating with are constantly referring back to.
Thank you very much. Now, we are sort of out of time, and I'm conscious that we have another session that many people will be joining sort of shortly after, so I want to make sure everyone has a break. But I just want to sort of thank you all and ask if there's any sort of final comments that you want to throw out there for attendees. Everyone's happy?
I suppose I'd say, like, by doing art history, you're onto a good thing. With it seems very obvious, with curatorship, there is that built into like the discipline of art history. There is that curatorial aspect to it. Very often, you know, the people who are teaching you are also curators or work very closely with curators, and that there is, like, you know, even within the National Trust, there is a sort of public recognition of like what art is at a very basic level and what it can provide. So, you know, you do have like a step up there over and above perhaps other academic disciplines. So like take heart from that, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think I'd just say that I think it's really positive that, you know, museums and galleries in particular, but other arts organisations as well, I think the disciplines are just much more fluid than they used to be. So the routes in maybe, you know, they don't need to be as linear as they perhaps once were. And I think everybody is, you know, most institutions are welcoming working more collaboratively, but also people's skills are also being valued in different ways. So I think we are moving forward in the right direction.
Okay, thank you all very much. We will wrap up there, and then everyone can have a little break before they join us this afternoon for grants and bursaries. But thank you, John, thank you, Mariam, thank you, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for joining us.